Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast where we have respectful discussion, we try to understand perspectives we disagree with, and we focus on current events. Today, I'm joined by Eric again. Eric, welcome, who is a writer for Our National Conversation. He's been on the podcast quite a few times, and we're going to be talking about the situation in Europe, essentially. America's relationship with Europe, the Trump administration's diplomatic posture, especially towards Ukraine. I think that the best place to start with this sort of discussion, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started, is of course that infamous meeting in the Oval Office. A very, I'm going to say just a very reality TV moment, except, we're dealing with really weighty international politics. So, Eric, I want to, kind of gauge your reaction to what happened there, and I want to gauge your thoughts on the kind of more important overall policy issues that we're facing here, and then we'll kind of get into the conversation more, see how I'm able to react to things.
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a lot of heartburn over this meeting on both
Mhm.
sides. To be frank with you, um, personally, I was at a Mardi Gras luncheon when this all went down, and my phone was just exploding. All my friends were like, "Dude, you got to check the news. You got to check the news."
Mhm.
But no, and I think two things can be true here. On ONC, we try to split the baby a little bit here. So I think Zelensky definitely came in looking to get something out of Trump that he wasn't going to give him. So you heard in the full 40-minute conversation, you heard him talk a lot about the need for security, right? He wants security agreements, which is that's an essential part of a ceasefire. That's almost a given that needs to happen. But Trump didn't want to come out and say that. And I think from, kind of the MAGA perspective, the minerals deal that was on the table that he came to sign was his kind of version of security. We're going to put Americans in your country. It's going to be almost like a trigger force, kind of like the trigger force that we put in West Germany during just after World War II to kind of, it's not like that trigger force would have been able to withstand any Soviet invasion. But if you had come in and, destroyed our forces, we would have had to respond to that. And I think that's kind of how Trump saw it. And he came very close to saying that maybe we'll get there after this, but first let's do this. I heard that Zelensky was talking with a few prominent Democrats, a few Obama age officials. Maybe he got some bad advice. Maybe he thought he could put Trump in front of the cameras and make him say the word security agreement. I don't really know. Either way, I think he was the initial antagonist. And his statement to JD Vance just about what negotiations, right? What negotiations? That's clearly kind of, poking the bear. But then I think JD also went off the rails a little too much. I think, he was right to be kind of indignant, maybe, but he also has to understand, like, you're in the White House, the American press is right here. I don't think it was wise to lose the handle like he did. For once, I think Trump was probably the most adult-like figure in the room, which is not something that we can say often. So yeah, I think there's two things can be true at once here with this situation.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Eric. I did think it's interesting because that's something I hadn't heard before. This idea of, okay, we're going to make this minerals, deal here. The U.S. is going to get access to all these resources, and that in and of itself is sort of an implicit security agreement because now the U.S. has more invested in Ukraine's status and its situation. And so, in Trump's mind, that might be sort of an equivalent, but it's in the lingo of trade and business as opposed to ideological and rhetorical support backed by very overt, military presence or support there. As for, I guess, the spat that occurred in the Oval Office, I really, I don't. I mean, it's important what our elected officials, what our policymakers say, and how they act. But I mean, this has been talked about a lot, and at the end of the day, I think that whoever we want to put blame on. There was a great deal of immaturity in the room, and I just kind of want to move on and talk about the policy issues themselves. So, Eric, what are you like? Kind of, what's your approach to the situation in Ukraine? What would you say is like, are you kind of in support of the posture that Trump is taking here? If so, I'd like to kind of hear more about where you're coming from there, because I myself might take a more skeptical approach. But I mean, I know you have very nuanced views as well. So, I mean, I just really don't know exactly where you stand on the overall policy posture of America towards Ukraine and Europe more broadly.
Sure. So I think I'm going to lay out, just some things that I've heard, different perspectives. Ezra Klein sat down. I forget who he was talking with, and they laid out kind of a few different visions. And I'll start with the more progressive leaning one. So this idea that there was a lot of talk before, or right in the immediate aftermath, and a little bit before that blow up, of Trump making a deal with Russia, an economic deal with Russia, to kind of kickstart the other side of these negotiations. And there's some talk, because a lot of people think that he's dictatorial in a lot of ways, that he's wielding power, that maybe America is kind of giving up totally on this idea of, the Western alliance, right? There was a little bit of speculation, would Trump pull out of NATO in that joint address to Congress? I think that was a little overblown, but there's this idea that maybe Trump, if he is truly a dictator, then he would want to align more with Putin and Xi over, Western leaders. So I think that's one lane, not one that I particularly find myself in. Um, and I think there's another lane that's kind of halfway in the middle to the other one, which is America is not the hegemon, and JD Vance and Trump are simply realizing that. We cannot force our will onto the Russians, and even if we could, I don't think we want to. So this gets into like the shipping lanes. Like, are we going to give up Taiwan to the Chinese? I hear there's some deals of moving the Taiwan main semiconductor company, moving some of those products into the U.S. Well, that would kind of give the game away on the country of Taiwan. If there's no semiconductors there, we can kind of let China dominate the South China Sea, which they've been doing anyways. Is this just a realization of Trump and Vance that we're not going to be the policemen of the world like, the old neocons in the day used to talk about? And then I think there's the third one, which I typically fall into, which is I don't think Trump moralizes any of this. I think he's strictly looking for deals. I think he's looking for deals with Russia. I think he's looking for deals with Ukraine. I think the tariffs are a part of that. I think he's using the tariffs as leverage with our allies, which a lot of people don't like. And I'm not totally. I don't really understand why we're tariffing Canada, but a little off track. But I think for the most part, this is a deal oriented president. We might like him to be more Wilson-esque in the way that he talks about democracy in other nations, but I just don't think he cares. And I think maybe that's the most open secret in Washington, is that the US doesn't actually really support democracies anymore. They just prop up whatever leader will make the best deals, the most free trade. So I think that's kind of where I land, is he's not moralizing any of this. He's strictly looking for deals from both Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, and is that where you say you would like kind of what an approach that you or maybe your circle is kind of in favor of? Would you prefer that to maybe say what the Biden administration was doing, which was much more, okay, we're behind our allies, we are, going to promote democracy, etc. We're going to send arms, that sort of thing. Like, do you think this more transactional approach is a boon, or are you really just not sure, and all you can really do is just analyze the landscape, look at, okay, here's the various perspectives, and only time will tell really what's the best option here?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm going to pull from two of the sides, which is I think Russia is so deeply entrenched in that eastern flank of Ukraine, the Donbass and Crimea, and they have some serious needs for that Blackwater or Black Sea port, because that's one of their only warm water ports. I mean, we could talk going back to Peter the Great about the Russia's need for warm water ports.
Mhm.
Um, so I think there's some reality to this. I don't think there's any point in just like Biden was kind of saying we're with Ukraine till the end, like the Western European leaders are doing right now, saying we're with them till the end. Like I saw that Starmer, Prime Minister of UK, put up another $2 billion for Ukrainian funding. And maybe that's another angle of this. Is Trump is doing a lot of this to get the Europeans to step up. But no, I think a deal should be made because I think it would take an outsized amount of money and possibly troops from NATO allies to really remove Russia from the places that they've entrenched themselves in the east. So I think it's time for a deal. I will say there has been a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians by the Trump administration, and not too much on Russia's Putin. Excuse me, Putin's Russia. Um, so I would like to see a little bit more, aggression from the Trump administration, bringing them to the deal, because it takes two to tango, of course. So I think that's where I stand.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, we do have, Trump just today actually said, yeah, and by the way, we're recording this on March 7th, said, okay, well, I'm going to threaten these banking sanctions on Russia, etc. Which I mean is something at least rhetorically, even though it wouldn't be very economically significant because we have very little trade with Russia at this time. There's already numerous sanctions in there, so yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that pressure would look like per se, but at the very least, a ramp up in the rhetorical pressure might be useful for signaling and assuring allies that even if we're adopting a more transactional stance here, it's not like a full flip into, hey, let's promote authoritarianism, that sort of thing. Um, I'm gonna maybe contest a little bit of what you said before, at least with just some alternative perspectives that I'm hearing. I was watching a really good. It was an interview with Foreign Affairs. It was their most recent episode. And they interviewed a Ukrainian journalist. I can't recall her name. Well, we can post a link to this discussion because I thought it was very interesting. And she had essentially said that apart from maybe a number of really vocal gung ho people in Ukraine, there's not really this perception that, okay, we're going to, absolutely like to hell with the rest of the world. We're going to sit here and fight no matter what, and we're going to win. Um, I think that there is a very, at least from my limited perspective, based on what I'm hearing, a very pragmatic perspective that, okay, we're not going to be able to, overturn Russia. We're not going to be able to, like, outright in a complete way win this war, but we can at least prevent Russia from having a good standing here. We can prevent Russia from having, substantial leverage going into negotiations. And in order to do that, we need to get to a point where we have continued military support from our allies, and from Western Europe, from the United States, so we're able to maintain the fight. And we need that pressure exerted by the Trump administration and others to try to bring Russia to the table so we can get some sort of peace deal or ceasefire that has security guarantees. So it's not, quite as easy for Putin to get a ceasefire going than like, when he's remobilized his military, go back in and start invading again. And with a fairly good Ukrainian standing in the war, at least as insofar as that's possible, so that we don't get walked all over in the peace negotiation itself. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm hearing there, which I think balances pragmatism with this desire to maintain continued funding and support from the Western Hemisphere essentially, or at least elements of it, the northern portion of the Western Hemisphere, or whatever other countries are heavily involved in supporting Ukraine. I'll need to double check the figures there. But what's your reaction to kind of a perspective like that? That's kind of more of the pragmatic, but still pro-Ukrainian approach, and against the Trump administration's efforts to really, really put pressure on Ukraine to have a ceasefire right now, with this lapse in military funding.
I'm glad to hear that. If that's the case, I'm glad to hear that because I think, you know, just looking at the relative size of the two countries, JD Vance even brought this up in that little spat that they're forcibly conscripting at least some people, which means that they're having manpower problems. Which if you believe even the lowest estimates, Ukraine has probably lost what 300,000 young men or young people. So I think unless the Western European nations are going to send troops into there, which I think no one really has an appetite for at this point. Yeah, I think it's necessary that we start being pragmatic. One other thing I want to mention, in terms of Putin making that deal, I've heard that somewhat of a red line for Putin are NATO troops within Ukraine, aka the security agreement that we're talking about. and that he would rather Chinese troops, and that I don't think that feels like a gap right now. That feels like the main gap. If I had to guess, you never know what's happening behind closed doors, but that we simply can't allow that as Western nations. And I do think it's important that while I do believe in a more deal making kind of approach for the United States in this position, we should obviously align ourselves more with the Western democratic nations of the world. And we are Putin is a dictator. Putin is one of the worst leaders that we have seen in the 21st century. And there's some sections of the MAGA right that I've been very displeased with. He's this semi-Christian kind of warrior, and that's all untrue. That's all untrue, and I think most of the right recognizes that. So yeah, no, I think pragmatism within the Ukrainian country, because I mean I hadn't heard any polling numbers from any of that. That sounds like it could spell a good future negotiation.
Yeah, yeah. And keep in mind, this is just kind of what I'm hearing. This is largely based off that discussion with that Ukrainian journalist in Foreign
Right.
Affairs, and some other things that I've been reading. So, maybe it's not true. Maybe that pragmatism isn't as widespread as I'm thinking, but that's kind of the perception that I'm getting. And I think that could potentially undercut some of the, I guess the talking points that the Trump administration is using to, say, okay, we need to kind of really cut funding now. We need to really create a ceasefire right now, because Ukraine's in the midst of a delusion or something like that. I guess we can kind of transition a little bit to the United States relationship with the rest of Western Europe at this time. So, obviously, with what Trump has been doing, it has created this incentive, and we're starting to see the effects of that, of a greater degree of mobilization, of European resources, support, etc. It seems like a lot of these European countries are committed to providing more, military support, etc., to expanding their own military spending. I mean, we're getting from various European leaders this assertion that yes, we're going to put a greater portion of, a greater percentage of our GDP into the military budgets, things like that. So, I mean, this is something that I I haven't really seen much controversy in the US thus far that in and of itself, just taken on its own, is sort of a silver lining or a boon of the Trump administration's policies. Maybe people disagree with, okay, how Trump is doing this. Maybe they disagree with the degree to which Trump is providing some rhetorical support for Putin, etc. But just the fact that Europe seems to be more committed to offering resources in support of this endeavor. I mean, that seems to be like a policy plus. So I guess I'm just curious, are you seeing like any, I guess, negative effects of this sort of thing, or is that, are people you're talking with saying, that, oh, it's bad intrinsically that European powers are spending more on this, the United States is spending less, etc. Like, I don't know, just what's your perception of the landscape as far as our discussions on, Western Europe, its spending, and the United States relationship with that kind of is? Like, what's your perception of the positions there?
Sure. I'm going to call this back to J.D. Vance's Munich speech, which, upset a lot of people. And one of the things he said in that speech that caused the most heartburn was, what are we defending as a NATO alliance? Because he remarked a lot about, some of the free speech concerns within Germany, within the UK, the arrests. And so I think, from the Trump perspective, I think he still views Western Europe as, our closest allies within that region, as he should. But I think there's a little bit of separation where there wasn't before. When the Biden administration, really, really, really was on the same page with these Western European leaders. I don't think that's the case with Trump. And I think the America First agenda kind of spells that out. I think it's mostly a semi isolationist kind of point of view, which I do not agree with. I think maybe there's some. Um, Maybe him playing tough. I heard that they canceled intelligence sharing with the Ukrainians. I think maybe yesterday. Um, I don't really see the logic in that unless you're trying to say the Ukrainians have lost their way, and we're just going to let Europe handle this. We're just going to let them do that. And I also heard a snippet from a speech from Emmanuel Macron the other day, saying we don't know if the U.S. is going to back back Ukraine up in the event of like a real, push against Russia. So we're going to have to step up. So, I'm not going to try and get into Trump's mind on this. But it does feel like there's a fair bit of gamesmanship. And I would like to think that if push came to shove, Trump would jump back in with, the NATO allies. I don't think he's going to pull us out of NATO. And, I think a lot of this is kind of tough talk and big talk, which Trump does a lot, I mean, even going back to term one, one of his big things was y'all need to pay your 2% of GDP into NATO. And now what are they saying? Y'all need to pay your 5% into NATO, So I think there's more deal making, from his perspective. But I would like to see us play nice in the sandbox again with our long-term allies from World War II.
Yeah, yeah. And on that playing nice, I guess, note, you talked a little bit about how there's this greater degree of maybe an ideological disparity between the United States and Western Europe, especially on issues related to free speech, which, J.D. Vance, Elon Musk, and others have been, really kind of hammering home there. And I've seen a fair bit of this, on the right. In fact, we actually published a piece in our national conversation by a previous intern named Ryan Dulani, who, he was a self-described conservative writer, and he, wrote a fairly scathing critique, offering his perspective on European policies with respect to hate speech, free speech, etc. And obviously, we're all on board with taking action against like violent activity, things like that, incitations to violence. But these, there are instances of putting people in prison, etc., for offering, these views, statements, etc., that would qualify as hate speech. And, I think that pretty much all of us can say are pretty despicable, but still it's just a speech act in and of itself. And now we're taking kind of this material I guess, criminal justice and an imprisonment based approach to dealing with that. So I don't know. What's your perception of this ideological divide? Are you kind of on that more conservative side of this spectrum, this position here? Or do you think that this isn't something that should really jeopardize our relationship with our longstanding allies? That this is, I guess, an ideological disagreement that comes secondary to, as you said, playing nice, to offering security guarantees, etc. Maybe still in a transactional way, but retaining our position very much on the side of Western Europe, that sort of thing. Especially given the fact that even if Europe is engaging in these sorts of policies, or Western Europe is, I doubt it compares much to the sort of repression that Russia engages in. So I just want to kind of get your thoughts maybe more on that ideological divide and its relevance to these security and geostrategic policy issues.
Absolutely. So I think, we can get a little bit into the weeds here with some European politics, which I quite enjoy. So Germany just had their elections. The AfD got around 20% of the vote, and Elon Musk and JD Vance both were getting warm with the AfD. And this is something that also happened in England. The Tory party didn't do as well as the CDU did. The CDU is now Friedrich Merz is now the prime minister of Germany, or I think they might have a president. I'm not exactly sure. Um, but you're seeing this kind of mirror image of kind of the populist wing in Europe represented by the AfD, represented by the Reform Party in Britain. And I think Trump and Vance align themselves more with that, kind of far right. I don't like using that term because I think there are aspects of AfD certainly that is far right, but I don't see the Reform Party as a far right party. But that's how they're referred to in legacy media. So I think Trump and Vance are certainly warmer towards them. And the Tory party and the Christian Democratic Union, which were the ostensibly conservative parties, have moved considerably to the left, especially on policies like immigration. And so I think there's definitely an ideological divide especially in the eyes of JD Vance. And I know you don't want to hang too much on that meeting, but I think Zelensky came into that meeting remembering what JD Vance has said, like, I don't care if Putin walks into Kyiv, like those are things that JD Vance has actually said. So, and I don't know. It's a difficult issue when we're talking about, one country's conservative party to one far right party to us, because there's a fair bit of differences within all of those. But just given the recent swing of European politics into this kind of the center right moving to the left and the right moving right, I think there is some ideological divide because none of those, far right parties have taken any amount of power really. Le Pen's party in France, the Vox party in Spain, their vote shares are going up, but they're not yet in power. So yes, I think JD Vance and Trump align more with them and not with the current leadership in Western Europe.
Yeah, and I don't really want to put you on the spot per se, but just for the sake of because obviously this podcast is built around really just trying to understand alternative perspectives here and dig
Right.
into the reasons behind those views, obviously within reason. And I guess I'm curious as to where you stand on kind of this posture that the Trump administration, JD Vance and Elon Musk especially, are adopting towards European policy on speech and relating it to our foreign policy posture towards Europe more broadly. Like, do you find yourself aligning with this kind of Trump-based perspective on these sorts of European policies, or do you think that I don't know, maybe it's overblown, or that there's some legitimacy behind the way Europe has been tending with respect to free speech?
No, I think I do align with the kind of the Trumpian vision on this issue. I think some of the free speech crimes that they've bringing up, and look, like you said, we can agree that what's being said are not anything that we would ever say, and things that we would condone if someone close to us said it. But that's a very different thing when you're arresting people. Germany, I think, did like 60 midnight raids one night. Um, I don't like seeing that, and I think JD Vance's speech at Munich really laid that out. So yes, I do believe that Europe has gone astray in a lot of ways. I think I don't totally share a lot of the perspectives of the more far right parties in Europe, because I'm an American, and the European idea of conservative politics can get a little wacky, at least to me. But no, I think they have separated themselves, and I think that was kind of the tone of Vance's speech, which is like, we're still here on the side of free speech. You guys are the ones that have changed. Um, I don't want to say that every crime, free speech crime that has been prosecuted by the German or British government is without cause, because there's been some, I believe, some revenge porn stuff. Like, there's been some pretty egregious stuff that should be prosecuted, and I want to make that known. But overall, I think when we start delving into what is hate speech, I'm kind of anti the concept of hate speech altogether. I think if you commit a crime, you have committed a crime, and that is what needs to be prosecuted. And I think adding years, this just going back to America real quick, the judicial process, adding years to a crime for the added crime of it being a hate crime is a new thing. I think that started maybe in the 90s, um, with some new judicial kind of precedents. And I don't agree with that. I think, if you commit a crime, that's all there is. We're not, if you start allowing the government to delve into your meaning behind your words and then saying, okay, this is what we define as hate, that's where I start to get uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it would be interesting to delve into that a little more because, obviously there is a lot of interpretation in a law, and implementing laws, implementing punishments, etc. Intention and motivation does come into play there. So we kind of have that framework embedded in our legal system already. But in your view, the issue, if I'm understanding you correctly, is when we take maybe elements of ideology to be relevant in the kind of determining what motivation is makes the crime worse or not, something like that. Like, if you intend to kill someone or not, that's sort of okay, that's where we stop in analyzing the motivation. But going more into the ideology behind it, or the kind of policy preferences, etc., that's going too far, and integrating partisan politics too greatly into the judicial system. I mean, is that the perspective that you're offering?
Yeah, and I think I'm going to draw a distinction here. I think intent is a very different thing than what hate speech is talking about. I
Mm.
think there are the factual, like the discovery aspect of a case. There are the facts, and here's what happened. It's almost like saying, well, you murdered your wife because she was cheating, So let's lessen it because maybe have just cause. It's like, no, like, and maybe that's not the best comparison in the world, but I think it's like if you start getting into the reasons why someone murdered someone and saying less or more crime or years for that crime, I think you're kind of going against the idea of justice, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean, that's, that makes sense to me. I guess, just to maybe delve into this a little more fully. Obviously we do have plenty of speech restrictions with respect to, comments that would incite violence or something like that. You can't yell bomb in an airport. There's sort of ways to constrict speech for the sake of public safety. And I think what's going on here is that a lot of people analyze elements of hate speech and say, okay, there's something here that has, a causal link to, violence being incited, and so for public health, we have to address this in some way. Like, do you think? Because obviously, that can become a slippery slope if we take that too far, because there's lots of different comments that you can link to, crazy people then engaging in violent acts, etc. So where exactly should we draw the analytical line? I mean, that's a pretty robust discussion to have, and we can't have that fully in this podcast here. But I don't know. I guess I'm curious as to whether you think that approach to analyzing hate speech, which I see, sometimes on the left, is like has some validity to it, and if implemented in a really cautious and sober way, could maybe, just be a reasonable extension of the speech restrictions we already employ for the sake of maintaining, public health. Like, I don't know, like, where do you see that sort of analysis? And is that something that you would say, okay, let's have more of a conversation there? Or do you think, okay, no, when you start getting into that territory, automatically you're creating a situation where the government can step in, restrict speech to such an extent that we're engaging maybe in something adjacent to or tending towards totalitarianism, just with that more liberal flair. I don't know. Where do you stand on this?
Sure. So I think it's important to understand first that this has always been a touchy subject. So there's this concept in judicial politics called fighting words, right? And this is a very complicated, one of the most complicated concepts that I've seen. And I took a judicial politics class in college, so most of my knowledge, with the history of this stuff, comes from that. Um, and if you go up to someone in the street, right, and you're calling them slurs and you're calling them all these other things, you're not quite there yet. That you haven't quite committed a crime. But then if you were to take reasonable action that could possibly endanger that person, aka fighting words, then you have reached into the area of crime, and then that person could respond, and then it would be self-defense. But that's a very fine line, and I think that's really hard to understand. So I don't think it would be a totally new thing if the government got involved in hate speech. I mean, it's not a new thing, but I don't think it would be totally out of the realm of possibility if the government started, kind of judging hate speech. But I do think that I don't feel it's necessary. If someone commits a crime, what motivates them to me is not nearly as important as the fact that they committed the crime. So I think, wow, it's a complicated subject to discuss in this short amount of time. It really is. So, but I think generally, I just don't think it's necessary to start litigating hate.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you for kind of sharing your perspectives there, Eric. I mean, it's, like I just kind of automatically, I think, with a lot of what I read, I tend towards the more progressive perspective on a lot of these issues. And but I can see that, okay, we need to have a basic commitment towards discussion, maintaining that, etc. And we do need some guardrails that would, maybe allow people to engage in really hateful speech acts, so long as it's not bleeding into, physical violence or something like that. But you're absolutely right. It's becomes a very, very complicated legal issue to differentiate between a lot of these things. And, like, what's the difference between fighting words and slurs? Is it context? Like, you go, like, can slurs be fighting words, etc.? Is that an incitation to violence? I don't know. It becomes very, very difficult. And you're right. Neither of us have the expertise to litigate this. So I'm just kind of acknowledging the issues and difficulties there. I
Right.
guess my other question would be, Um, what sorts of measures do you think, if we're just going to kind of focus on substantive policy here, maybe not government policy, maybe this is, a matter of like civics, culture, maybe this is a matter of policies that can have an indirect effect on this sort of thing. But obviously, we're all committed to, doing everything we can to reduce hate speech, to reduce bigotry, etc., even if it's not by putting people in prison for the comments they offer. So, what sorts of solutions do you think might be able to cultivate a common ground on this subject that you'd imagine both Republicans and Democrats can get behind in addressing, something that we all despise, but from different angles and with willingness to take different kinds of steps? Like, do you think that there's kind of a policy solution here, or at least an initial step towards one that would be productive? Or, is this like, okay, we're still in the midst of the discussion and I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on this. So, in the Weimar Republic, leading up into World War II and Hitler's rise to power, there was a lot of free speech restrictions. I mean, they threw Hitler in jail for multiple reasons. One of them leading a revolt, but a lot of some they had a lot of strict hate speech laws on their books. And there's some argument that if you completely outlaw this kind of speech, that it gains almost this kind of shininess to people who haven't heard it before. They're saying, oh, well, if the government, which is doing all this other bad stuff that I don't like, is also banning these people, maybe they're saying something that's true. So I think if I had one answer to this, it would be free up all the platforms. And I know that sounds like, oh my gosh, you're gonna let the cat out of the bag. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't prosecute illegal speech, because there is illegal speech. If you're threatening someone, if you're calling for incitement, right, that should be illegal and that should be taken down and prosecuted. But I think if you do not free up the platforms and you kind of allow this stuff to fester, then I think that's when you can see a problem. Is there any one solution to combating bigotry and hate? No, I don't think so. And I think a lot of this is going to be on the average everyday citizen. When you hear that, whether it be on Twitter or whether it be, God forbid, someone in your own social circle, you have to call it out. And that's a very high-minded principle. But I think, those two things in conjunction, if you have people actively fighting, the hate that they see online, but that is allowed to be there. So, people who maybe would tend towards kind of that far right kind of those ideas can say, oh, well, this man offered a great rebuttal to why, Jews don't run the world and aren't the worst thing that has ever happened, right? Because I see a lot of that on X, and it's frightening. You don't want to see that kind of nastiness. But then I see the people, the warriors with their Israeli flags in their bios saying, no, 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 you're lying right now. And that always gives me some kind of, like, oh, thank God there's people out there willing to combat this kind of really ugly and vile stuff. So I would say, free speech policy to the max.
That's an interesting point, and I think that maybe what I've gotten out of what you just said there, it's actually something similar that I got out of the last podcast episode and in my my and other writers' discussions with Connor on a variety of social issues, is that really a lot of what we're saying here when we have these divergent policy perspectives on how we should handle hate speech and other issues, it's rooted in a similar desire to say curb bigotry or promote a healthy democracy. There are shared values there. At least, I
Right.
mean, I can't get into, Trump's or JD Vance or Elon Musk's minds. I don't know what's going on there precisely. Maybe they're on board with everything you said. Maybe they're not. I'm not sure. But, at the very least, having this conversation with you has shown me that there's a kind of cross-partisan or cross-ideological commitment to this sort of thing. But there's very different conceptions on how to reach that. And I think that can become lost in the partisan dialogue when we start to we start to blend disagreement over means with disagreement over ends, and kind of the sort of thing that we're aiming for. And I think maintaining that distinction and being very clear about really trying to understand what's motivating the other side, what they believe in, is exceedingly important, because otherwise, I might go on in my echo chamber or whatever else thinking that, oh, Eric, he's on board with those far right parties in Germany, et cetera, and that sort of thing. But that's not the situation at all. It's far more nuanced than that. So I appreciate you offering your views, Eric. I appreciate you for kind of walking me through how you're conceptualizing, our policies towards Europe. And I'm excited for our next discussion.
Yep, as always, Sam, it's a pleasure. I think, the world could benefit from more conversations like this and, a free and beautiful exchange of ideas.
Yeah, there you go. All right, thank you, Eric. And as for our audience, I am curious. Kind of what you think about these broader issues, with respect to ideological divides between the US and Western Europe. Where do you stand on speech regulation, and how do you think that relates to the sorts of policies that we should be adopting, with like security guarantees for, Ukraine, our geostrategic relations with other European powers? Like, just what's your reaction to the sort of policy issues that we've been talking about here? And with that, we're going to go ahead and end. Have a great day.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.